Reverend Barber, we have a few questions that have come up to us from the friends who are here listening to you tonight. One friend said, so much of today's politics plays on and encourages fear.
Who is that talking? Where is she at?
Could you say something about how we overcome this political polarization that's been brought about in part by fear, and how we can unite people across the political spectrum to stand together in our moral witness?
You know, fear is really the opposite of love, not hate. You know, hate is not the opposite of love, it's fear. And as I said, this is deliberate and by design. The sowing of fear to pit us against one another is not something haphazardly. It didn't just start in 2018, for instance. That's why you have to be careful just to focus on Trump. Trump he played to an audience that's been developed for 50 years. Dr. King in '65 said every time there's the potential for the black and white poor people to come together, the slave, white, racist aristocracy always plays them against one another. So one of the ways we have to do it is to understand that it's deliberate and not buy into it. Number two, we got to build a movement, not a moment. That's what the Poor People's Campaign is trying to do, that has that addresses all 5 issues at the same time, that does not ask people to leave their organization. We're not trying to put everything under the Poor People's Campaign. Poor People's Campaign is not about an organization, it's about a movement, it's about an organism, right? It is about people coming together where the impacted people lead. That's the other piece of it. We've got to put the face on the facts so that America begins to fear not each other, but what's going on. Joseph Stiglitz, you read his book, he says the cost of inequality. He flipped that question. You know, normally people say, well, what is the cost if we do all of this, if we do living wage, we do. Joseph Stiglitz said there's a deeper question. What is the cost of inequality, right? And so there is a place in which we want people to fear what racism can end up doing, what poverty does. I want people to be afraid of 250,000 people dying so that they'll stand up against it. We have to create a counter-narrative. That's part of what the Poor People's Campaign is doing. That narrative must be rooted in love and truth and justice. It must be deep, it must be broad, it must be moral, not trying to do anything for any one particular party, but calling people together across all of our racial lines. People told us, you can't get black women in West Virginia to stand with black women in Alabama where we're doing it in the Poor People's Campaign. They said you can't, and that's because people have accepted the divisions. They've accepted the division. They said, well, you can't change things down south. Do you know right now in the southern states, if you register 30% of the unregistered black voters and they vote with the progressive whites that are already on the books and brown people, you can fundamentally shift 4 or 5 states in the South, which fundamentally changes the politics in America. The problem is sometimes we have begun to believe. Do you remember when the children of Israel went in the Promised Land, they sent 12 spies over and 10 of them came back and said, we're just grasshoppers? I'm trying to flip that over and say to people, listen, if to be moving forward and progressivism, folk had to go all the way to Russia, had to lie, had to do voter suppression, had to put pornographic sums of money into the election process. If they had to do all that, that doesn't mean you're weak. Because people don't cheat you when you're weak. People cheat you when you're strong because they can't beat you. So we have to flip this thing over. You know, right now people are, oh, Trump. I had to tell one group, stop acting like he's the Lord. You know, the other day somebody, the era of Trump. This ain't the era of Trump. God is still on the throne. Huh? The divine is still divine. So we have to begin to, we have to re-narrate. That's one of the things about the Poor People's Campaign, to hear people that face it every day talk about their willingness to fight back. Took the fear out of me, you know. And the fear, when I go in the homeless camp and all different races, colors, and creeds are right there, that takes the fear of others out. And so a movement, only a movement can do that. It can't just be done in the election year and then after the election year we all go home. It has to be a movement that's committed to the long-term goal of changing the narrative, of engaging in nonviolent fusion, moral civil disobedience, and building power from the bottom up, of people impacted. Did any of y'all see did any of y'all see the march that we had after the 40 days online? Have you seen that? If you're not, you need to go again to breachrepair.org or poorpeoplescampaign.org, and you need to look at that piece. If you want to be some hope, you need to look at it and watch impacted people, not people speaking for them, but watch people standing together in community across every race, creed, color, and sexuality. It's being done right in front of us. What I say to how do we do it? Join what's being done. So I'm calling on all of you all to join. Go to that 90975 and click in, type in action and hook up so we can continue to build this movement and show America what America can be, what America must be, what America has to be.
In regard to the 40 Days project, after that, what's next? Mm-hmm. And what are the goals of the Poor People's Campaign for the next 12 months?
Yeah. Well, if we don't just have a 12-month strategy, I want to invite you, first of all, I want to invite you to go to the campaign website where I said poorpeoplescampaign.org or the other breachrepairs.org and read the agenda. Because this is a very serious agenda so that it's not rooted in personality but in an agenda. We have a meeting this coming week where we're lining up the next steps because one of the things we have to do is sometimes progressives, we run to the next thing before we take in what we already did. So I told folks, first of all, stop for a minute and breathe and be quiet like Quakers and listen to what already did. We, over the last 3 years, visited 40 states. We have 40 coordinating committees now, led by impacted people and clergy in 40 states. We had 40 straight weeks of action. Nearly 4,000 people presented themselves for civil disobedience. The historian said that's never happened in the history of this country. In 37 states plus the District of Columbia. We got 15 million Twitter impressions. The message has gone out from here all the way across the world. On the day that we had our last gathering, there were 7 other countries that had simultaneous gatherings. There's something happening. You see what I'm saying? And so right now, we're trying to evaluate the power and what has happened and what occurred. And we didn't. And so the next steps, though, is to continue to shape the narrative. Because part of the problem is right now, when it comes to poverty and race, it's not even on the narrative. What politicians talk about is the military and the middle class. So politicians actually disable movement because the language is not elastic enough for movement. The language is too limited. Just like they call people, they say, well, the right. And I keep wondering why, for the Democrats, why do you keep calling people right and then try to convince us they're wrong? You know, why do you use that language? Why don't you call them extremists or something? So we are going to have to shift the language. Have you noticed that this past week when women gathered, they were talking about moral issues. When the young folk over the guns, have you noticed? Have you started noticing how more people are using the language? It's because the movement is starting to penetrate. So we've got to continue that. Secondly, we're going to have massive voter mobilization, not just for 218, but beyond. We're going to begin to do that, and you're going to hear more about that, and then we're going to build more power from the bottom up. We're not finished. The 40 days and those actions was just the beginning. Now, I must tell you that I'm a little like, I'm very Quaker in this way, that I don't believe in telling everything when the camera's running. I do know how to be quiet. So I will say to the questioner, I can't put it all out here right now. Okay, but we need you to sign up. Go to 90975, type in action so you can be in the crowd. Because when the light is in the window, it might mean this is the house of a friend. You know what I mean? Okay.
The next question is a two-part question regarding strategy. One friend wrote, in the 1990s, Heidi Hartman at the Institute for Women's Policy Research found the #1 factor for raising women out of poverty was union membership. Union membership mattered more than an additional year of education, public assistance, and minimum wage for getting lifted out of poverty. So the question there is, how can unions play a role today?
Well, right now unions are under attack. The Supreme Court is trying to undermine public service unions. And there's a history to that. Right after the Montgomery bus boycott happened, a lot of states passed laws against public service unions. It was in the 50s, because they didn't want to see black and whites, come together. So number one, we have to fight to protect a right for workers to organize. That is critical. But on the other side, when I was at the Vatican recently, presenting at an invitation by the Pope, it was a group of us that came to respond to one of his encyclicals, and the Pope sent us a letter telling us, he said, there's one problem, he said, in the labor rights movement, though. He said, if the labor rights movement is only concerned about the next contract and does not join the fight for voting rights, the fight against racism, the fight against poverty, then it is abdicating its God-ordained responsibility in the earth. So we've said to the union movement that the union movement can't make the mistake that it made in 1968, and that was that the union movement walked away from Dr. King, the Poor People's Campaign. So did the Civil Rights Movement. That's the history we don't want to talk about. He was pretty much out there with basically a few friends, that came along. But the NAACP that I love wrote a resolution against Dr. King. And so did other civil rights organizations. So what we can't do is for the union movement to think that there's a way forward where they're just over here by themselves worrying about the contract. We need to have people involved in unions, but unions have to use their membership to fight for voting rights. Why? This difference in voting rights. In voting rights, every state that passed voter suppression laws also passed anti-union laws. Every person that got elected because of voter suppression is also anti-union. Is also anti-living wage. Every one of them. And so you can't separate. In America, when somebody says, is it race or is it class, you need to say, it is. It is. There's not some strange dichotomy, right? So we need, yes, we must fight, all of us, whether we're part of a union or not, must fight for union rights and labor rights and push those things. But then we also need the labor movement, like it was recently in the Poor People's Campaign. 7 of the major labor leaders came and did something people said was a miracle. They didn't speak. Instead, they pushed one of their workers, who was a low-wealth worker, to speak. And that was powerful, right? The president said, I don't want to speak today. I want the worker to be in power and to speak to the nation. And normally when you have a mass meeting on D.C. in the mall, that's national platform, national leaders. But what we said, we need to nationalize everyday people, right? And put a face on the problems of poverty and injustice.
The retirement of Justice Kennedy from the Supreme Court opens the door to further rollbacks in social justice and human rights, civil rights. What strategies are open to us to offset future court decisions?
Yeah. Well, first of all, we have to fight this one. We can't just assume. There's some people talking about now they're going to do an Occupy D.C. I mean, we need to fight this. And Democrats and progressives, if there are any Republicans, need to fight this. We need to, number one, call for regular order. Go back to 60. They may not do it, But just like Justice Harlan was the lone dissenter when the Supreme Court voted that Plessy versus Ferguson was the law of the land, if we're going to build a fight for the future, we must dissent in the present. We must dissent to the point that we build a foundation of dissent. Because I believe this about protest. If you're protesting for what's right, rooted in love and justice, you either win now or you lay the foundation for people to win later. And so we have to start thinking about what do we seed to the next generation. And the thing we can't seed to them is that we stood down just because some other folk had a majority. We must have massive outcry. We must connect. We cannot just make this about Roe versus Wade. Now, don't y'all get mad at me. Hear what I'm trying to say. It is about Roe versus Wade, right? But that's the game they want us to play, to only be about, they're going to want to make it only about abortion. We have to make it about women's rights, but we also have to say we're about to put a justice on the bench that will vote on voting rights, will vote on labor rights, will decide what is executive power. We have to have a fusion fight back. We can't allow everybody who wants to preserve Roe versus Wade to be over here and not say anything about these other issues. And right now we're organizing a piece around that because this is very dangerous in the area of Jewish prudence, what we're seeing now. First of all, the seat that they have now was stolen. You know, that's something that you'd see in Moscow somewhere. You know, they stole the seat. And now they're trying to steal another one through the simple majority and do it before every argument they made for not filling the former seat, they're now, right? And so Democrats are going to have to pull out every stop they have. They're going to have to go, they're going to have to go back in the lineage of Byrd, who was the senator from West Virginia. Now, he was a former Ku Klux Klan member, but he changed. So you know, but one thing I love about Mr. Byrd, he found every trick inside those Senate rules. And right now, Democrats ought to have somebody that's doing nothing but finding every way to slow down the process. I mean, you know, there might be something that John Quincy Adams did. They need to use that. I'm serious, you know, right? And then we have to again, that's why we have to take the Senate. The Senate has to be in this coming election. That's why, but you know we only need a 12 to 15% voter turnout above the 2014 election to have a massive change. It's not that you need 70% more. So we have to fight now. And even if we lose, see, this is the thing about justice movement. Justice never really loses. It gets beat up sometimes, but ultimately it never loses because, as I said, you either win today or you set the foundation. Charles Hamilton Houston lost a whole lot of cases, and he built his attack on separate but equal from the dissent of Justice Harlan, who came from Kentucky. He was called the lone dissenter. If Justice Harlan had not dissented, Charles Hamilton Houston would not have had his dissent, his legal dissent from which to build legal theories. Then Charles Hamilton Houston didn't attack equal protection under the law head on. He first tried to say, okay, if equal protection is the law of the land, then make it equal. And when they couldn't make it equal, he then went after it. But that was 30 years of courtroom work. Thurgood Marshall then used all of that to overturn it. We have to have a long view. And that is why we can't, if we're serious about what we see happening now, we can't just have a strategy for the next election, but the next election, the next election, and the next election, and the next election, because what we have found out is these folk who want to take the democracy in a different way, they plan and they do not rest. They continue. They have a strategy for a long time. It was an article in the New York Times when Charles Koch had a meeting. You can Google it. And he told his funders, I think it was back in 1980, he said, we're no longer going to support Messiah candidates. We're going to build a movement that can punish people. He said, and we're going to do it from the bottom up. He said, we're going to get people elected from the bottom up and kind of have them in training camps. We're going to get us a whole group of lawyers, and we're going to have them in what is it called when the baseball players, what they call? The bullpen. He said, we're going to train them. They're going to train them. He said, we're going to fund radio stations and radio programs and TV programs. He had like this 40-year strategy, right? He said, and what we're going to end up, he said, and now the article says what progressives did that they made a mistake on is we started chasing Messiah candidates and not build a movement. Now, where did Charles Koch get his theory from about building a movement? Dr. King. Because in 1963, when Dr. King came to the March on Washington, you know he never told us to go back to Washington? Think about his speech. He never said, until the poor people came, he never said, go back to Washington, come hear me speak again. He said, go back to Alabama, go back to Mississippi, and build a state movement. That's what the Koch brothers did. They built a state movement with the foundation being the South and states like Ohio and Kansas and places like that. They are very number oriented. And so we got to fight this judgeship. And then even if we lose, we have to fight it. And then if you want to deal with the Supreme Court, we have to build a massive voter mobilization team, because that's how they get nominated. And we cannot, if we're serious about not having a president that will nominate extremist judges, we're going to have to get serious in this nation about winning in the South and winning in the Rust Belt and stop writing people off, because there are a whole lot of good people that just haven't been touched, just haven't been talked to. I was recently, quick, and then I'll take one more question. I was in Harlan County. I was recently with the Hatfields and the McCoys. No, I'm serious. They told me, they said, you can't go to Eastern Kentucky and organize the Poor People's Campaign, because in Eastern Kentucky, they voted 89% for Trump. I said, so? Maybe they voted for Trump because anybody will drink dirty water till they get some clean water. And so our organizers went out. We had 500 people show up in Harlan, Kentucky. And none of them looked like me. Well, there was a couple of albinos, but other than that, none of them looked like me. I'm just joking. And they understood, and they understand that we have to have this movement. And then we went to West Virginia, and these women came out of the hills and said, we're in the movement. You know, the problem is some of our politicians have become too doggone arrogant. And we've isolated our politics and worried about a winning strategy rather than building a movement that will lift the whole country. And I hope this movement will help change that.
This is our final question. I'm 16.
Uh-oh, where you at? Where are you?
And I want to move.
Come here, 16, where are you?
Morley, are you in here?
Come here, 16, come here. Hey, 16. Come on up here. How you doing? What's your name?
Marley.
Marley. Now, what's Marley's question? Yeah, let's come on, Marley.
All right. Does it work? Oh, it works. I'm 16 and I want to move. I want to change things. But the adults around me are terrified of money. They don't say get your education for yourself. They say get your education to get a good job, a job that pays well. And that fear is real. Poverty can mean death. How do I look past the priority of wealth? Should I? I'm young, I'm awake, and I'm terrified.
Young. Come on, 16. The very fact that you have the audacity to raise that question, I want you to stay young. I sure enough want you to stay awake. And you ought to be terrified, but not to the point that it makes you stand still. There are different kinds of fear. I was afraid tonight coming here, standing up here. I've been preaching 30 years, but I'm always. Sometimes it gets to me when I get ugly notes and people say what they're going to do. But there is an inner something, right? That courage is not the absence of fear. You know, it is the presence of a commitment and a faith. I understand, you know, I'm a parent now. I want my children to have certain things. But I also have told them that education is not merely for money and not merely to lord over people, but if you get it, it's to use it for the betterment of humankind. Don't ever discount education, because I tell people one of the worst things you can be is loud and wrong. You know, every statistic you heard me speak tonight was footnoted, because they will tear you apart if you just say stuff and have no basis for it. But I will say that there is a wealth that specifically comes out of service, right? And it has always been young people that have broken the way open. When there was giants in the land of Israel, it was a young David. You know, Jesus was not some old guy. He was 12 years old when he was up in the temple. Martin King was not some old dude. He was 20-some years old. Went to college when he was 15, seminary when he was 19. Mott and Coffin did not wait till they were old. But I also want to say there doesn't have to be a false dichotomy between age and youth. There are many, many people who are of age who have great vision and great knowledge, and they still have fire in them. Find them. Because there's a scripture that says your young men are for battle and your old men are for counsel. And so you want to find them. Connect yourself with a movement that is moving, right? So where you stay? Where do you stay? Where you live?
Minnesota.
Minnesota. So I want to personally invite you to join in the Poor People's Campaign, and I want to connect you with the Millennial Young People's Poor People's Campaign Facebook community. And there are 4,000 of them that are now gathering, right? Not as a side to the movement, not off to the side, but they are in the center of the movement, right? Because what you want to do is connect with community, right? The Bible talks about in the multitude of counsel there is safety, right? So you want to connect to the community. Your parents and others sometimes, and you know, are always going to be concerned. You know, and it is possible to have wealth and conscience. See, I believe, she doesn't believe that yet. You will one day. And what I mean by that is, mean folk got mean money. Don't ever understand, Dr. King took of our poverty, but somebody had to pay for his plane ticket. Right, somebody had to help them organize. Those shanties that were built on the mall in '68, it was some engineers that figured out how to do that, right? And so remember that that's always out there too, because we need certain things. I spoke here tonight, but I couldn't walk here. You know, had to catch some way to come here. So what I want to encourage you as a young person is to figure out where we don't necessarily have to have false dichotomies, but where we can figure out how to bridge the two and come together. And one of the best places to do that is in a movement. When I saw in D.C., young people, they couldn't be 16 because the 16-year-olds couldn't get arrested. But the 16-year-olds were passing out flyers. The 16-year-olds were helping people after they got out of jail. The 16-year-olds were helping us manage the movement and preparing themselves. Like as soon as I get 18, as soon as I get 18. Okay. But lastly, I love this line. I want to change things. And what I want you sweet 16 now, when I see you at sweet 18, I want you to say, Reverend Barber, I want to change things. And when you're 32, I want to hear you saying, I want to change things. And when you're 81 like Moses, I want you to still be saying, I want to change things. Because until there are people in the earth who want to change things, change will never come. That is an affirmation for the world. Miss 16. You see that lady? Come here, Cashmere. I believe in hooking up people. Come here, Cashmere. Cashmere, this young lady is from Oakland. Cashmere, she's a young lady. She told me she was going to come to work for us, right? And she has a master's in public policy, but she's another young person. So I want you to go over there and sit with her, and y'all exchange things and hook up. And we're going Cashmere and who? And Marley, is that right? Mm-hmm. Marley and Cashmere. She said, we got this. All right, y'all got this. All right, okay. Take care.